So let's keep going. Let me see how much time I got. 15 minutes. We're doing good. Proponents' views. Let's look now at those two gentlemen that I mentioned earlier, Rosenthal and Van Kampen, the fathers of the name of the pre-wrath view. Robert Van Kampen mentions in his book, The Sign, well, he emphasizes that the Great Tribulation is primarily the persecution of the saints by the Antichrist, distinct from God's wrath which follows. So this is a perspective that I believe is accurate. I'm following this perspective at the moment. And Van Kampen, again, is not he's not creating theology. He's simply articulating theology that is, I believe, entirely biblical. And I believe it's proper to make this distinction because I believe from my own research, this is the distinctions that are brought up by the Bible. They're not artificial like pre-tribbers like to charge we pre-wrathers with. I don't believe it's artificial because I'm using the verbiage and nomenclature that Jesus himself applied to certain time frames within the 70th week of Daniel. Another quote, a proponent's view, is Marvin Rosenthal, like I mentioned earlier. He explains that the tribulation is a period of Satan's wrath through the Antichrist. It's distinct from the subsequent wrath of God. This is according to his book, The Prewrath, Rapture of the Church. Again, I own both of these books. Let's keep going. We've got 50 minutes so we can start looking at wrath as well. Definition. According to the pre-wrath view, this perspective says that wrath refers to the period of divine judgment and retribution that God pours out on the ungodly after the rapture of the church. This day is known as the day of the Lord. It's important, again, let me go back over and show you that in my attempt to disambiguate these two terms, tribulation from wrath, in the pre-wrath model, you can see that we label the time period that commences after the midpoint as the Great Tribulation, right after the name, so because Yeshua uses that phrase, the Great Tribulation, with a definite article and the adjective attached. It's a time period that seems to be marked out within the 7-year period that even, in fact, if I back up into my slides, if I back up and look at the other three models, pre-trib rapture also recognizes a great tribulation, although it's a bit longer than what we pre-wrathers say, but they still recognize a distinct great tribulation. Look at mid-trib, they do the same thing. A distinct great tribulation time period that commences after the midpoint of the week, after the abomination of desolation. And classic post-tribbers do the same thing. They've got this time period that commences after the abomination of desolation at the midpoint, which is labeled Great Tribulation. So, stopping here at this slide with pre-wrath, we're not without warrant. We're just standing on the shoulders of research that has come before us and recognizing that at the midpoint, something unique happens. We're simply shortening that time period because within the context of those verses that I read a moment ago, Matthew 24, 21, and 22, Jesus says that this time period will be cut short. And if you say that it's the 3.5 years that's cut short, then you disagree with Daniel. You neuter Daniel's time frame, and you also make nonsense of John's details given in the book of Revelation about the 3.5 years, 422 months, times half a times, 1,260 days. So you can't say that the 3.5 years is cut short. Likewise, if you say that the 7 years is cut short, Matthew 24, 22, 21 and 22. If you say that it's the 7 years that's cut short, you also destroy Daniel's time frame. In fact, they're no longer 77s anymore. It's 69 sevens and a fragmented 7, something to that effect. It's no longer 70 weeks, 490 years. It's now 69 sevens, but the 70th 7 is not a full 7. You blow that thing away. Plus, there's no such, the phrase at the midpoint of the week that Daniel talks about. In the middle of the week, he says in Daniel 9, around verse 27, I believe, 24, 25, 26, 27, in that group of verses, he says, at the midpoint of the week, in the middle of the 7, in the middle of the heptad. Well, last time I checked, the middle of a heptad is 3.5. So if you don't have a heptad to begin with, if it's shorter than a heptad, that's the technical word for 7. I'm parking out on this for a specific reason. If you shorten the 7, then you no longer have a heptad. It's no longer a 7. It's no longer a shavua in the Hebrew. You lose the force of the phrase week or 7, literal. So we can't shorten that either. So we're left with, really, I think the most logical option is the 7 is not shortened, the 3.5 is not shortened, because if you shorten either one, then the math falls apart. Thus, the only logical choice is that you shorten the Great Tribulation. And that is conveniently the immediate antecedent noun that even in the Greek case matches, right? Because Greek has gender case, right? And it has case endings that indicate, so you can understand which words are connected to certain clauses and phrases that are surrounding it. And so the case endings allow us to realize that the Great Tribulation and the cutting short in those days are all connected. So what's my point? Going back to our definitions of wrath, wrath is something that the Bible defines as happening after the cutting short of the Great Tribulation. In other words, they're not overlapping terms. They're not overlapping events. Although, again, don't get me wrong, there is a sense in which all of the 70th week is a tribulation period. I don't call it the 7-year tribulation, though, because I think that nomenclature is misleading. But there is a sense, I get it, there's bad stuff happening throughout the week, and we could call that bad stuff tribulation, and thus we could say the 7-year tribulation if you want to kind of go in that direction. I'm not going to nitpick on that, but I think it's not as helpful. The 7-year Great Tribulation, I definitely wouldn't go with that verbiage. And the 7-year wrath of God, I don't ascribe to that either. And so the point that I'm bringing up at this part of my slide is the pre-wrath perspective. Wrath refers to the period of divine judgment and retribution that God pours out on the ungodly after the rapture of the church. This is a smaller time frame. It's a concentrated time period. And so, as I'm drawing this part to a close, wrath key points, just like I had tribulation key points, let's look at some key points for wrath. And we've got another quote from some authors. God's wrath on the ungodly. 1 Thessalonians 5:9. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. I'm not going to unpack this verse tonight. I'll do it in later ones, but suffice to say that the post-trib doesn't believe that this wrath here is referring to the eschatological wrath. They believe that this is referring to the what we might call the universal wrath that God has reserved for unrepentant sinners at the very end of time, i.e. great right throne judgment. God has not destined us for wrath, but for salvation. Just like they juxtapose wrath with salvation, eternal salvation is what they believe this verse is talking about. Therefore, the wrath must be referring to eternal wrath, i.e. at the very end of the millennium when the great right throne judgment takes place on unbelievers. I don't follow that line of reasoning. I do believe that Paul is speaking of the limited eschatological wrath. Thus, this puts salvation also limited in the eschatological sense of the word. But this doesn't mean that the backdrop isn't the eternal versions of those two words. But I'll deal with that a little later. Just suffice to know that right now the pre-wrathers take this word wrath here to be the eschatological wrath that is confined primarily to the 70th week of Daniel. Key points continue. This passage suggests that believers are not appointed to suffer God's wrath, implying a separation between the tribulation they endure and the wrath that follows. So if we're talking about eschatological wrath, then we're talking about a differentiation between the tribulation that we do go through versus the wrath of God that we don't go through. And remember what I said earlier. There are a growing number of Christians in all four camps, although probably the pre-tribbers are going to have the hardest time articulating this version. But I can comfortably say that at least in the post-trib camp, there used to be a lot of just classic post-tribbers who said, we're going to go through everything. There's no need to have us be removed from any part of it. God knows how to protect his people. However, a growing number of post-tribbers have been researching the pre-wrath proposal, and I believe they've started to accept the argument that language is showing that, or indicating that Christians, yes, will go through tribulation, as in great tribulation, but also that we are promised deliverance from wrath. We're excused. God doesn't need to shelter us in place, Goshen principle style, right? Greater Exodus style. He doesn't need to do that because we've already got verses that articulate a deliverance from the wrath of God. So I believe that the sheltering in place Goshen principle, while it probably does apply to Israel, unbelieving Israel to be sure. I think there's a good case that must be made because they're not going to be rapture ready when the time comes. So we do need to hold to that. I believe that's accurate. But when it comes to the Christians, the church universal, rapture language is already supplied by the Bible, so we don't need to speculate about being sheltered in place. I believe that speaking of Christians being sheltered in place, instead of focusing on just Israel, speaking of Israel being sheltered, speaking of Christians being sheltered in place, I think that's speculation. Why speculate when we have verses that give a clear enough indication that we will be rescued from that time frame? So, key points number 2, the day of the Lord, Joel 2:30-31. Remember, the day of the Lord language in the New Testament is rooted squarely in the day of the Lord language in the Old Testament. What does Joel say? Notice not just the details, but notice also the sequencing phrasing. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. And then he describes the classic 6th seal sign that Zion's Hope ministry labels cosmic disturbances. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. When? After the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Nope, doesn't say after. During the great and awesome day of the Lord. Nope, doesn't say during. He says before. Before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So this, taken at face value, this word in the English, which the original Hebrew and Greek are similar in meaning. There's no kind of nuancing going on here. The word before, well, I guess there would be a slight nuance given a different passage, but the context is easily understood. Before here refers to sequentially preceding, as in it's a sign, it's a precursor, it's a portend, it's something that's indicative of something that's about to follow. So the sign of the sun, moon, and stars behaving oddly, what we call cosmic disturbances, is itself an indicator of the immediate impending judgment of the day of the Lord that's about to arrive. And this sign is woven throughout enough passages in the Bible that allows us to accurately begin our compositing. In fact, it's where I actually start my compositing feature. It's one of the staple tent pegs that I use to composite many of my Old Testament passages with many of my New Testament passages regarding this chronology and sequencing of the Day of the Lord events, Rapture, Tribulation, Day of the Lord, all those events that are kind of closely connected in our discussion. So let me conclude with our key wrath points here. Let's bring in some authors, and then I'll close. These cosmic signs precede the day of the Lord, a time associated with God's judgment. Plain and simple, they precede. If we take Joel's wording at face value, before the day of the Lord. We have another key point verse in the book of Revelation for God's wrath. Point number 3, Revelation 6:16-17. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, these are the unbelievers speaking, by the way, when they see this sign, right? This is their response. Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of the wrath has come, and who is able to stand? In time, we'll also unpack that phrase in the Greek, has come. But suffice to say that for now, a good translation is what we're looking at, has come. It's an aorist tense verb, which means it has really no time marker attached to it. It's simply describing primarily the reality of the event, the surety that the event is in front of us. Arrival might be a good way to describe it. For the great day of the wrath has arrived. Okay. Key points continuing. According to the Prewrath view, this passage marks the beginning of God's wrath, which follows the cosmic disturbances described earlier in the chapter. This is important for disambiguating the nomenclature that is included in Rapture discussions about tribulation versus wrath. We pre-wrathers are careful to try and look at this wrath of God as already being outlined in the Bible as occurring after a certain event, after a certain sign. And thus, the wrath marks the beginning of these cosmic, the cosmic disturbances mark the beginning of God's wrath, not the beginning of the 70th week, like the pre-tribbers say. They say that wrath starts at the very beginning of the week. But that means if there's a sign that happens after the week has already begun, after the wrath has begun, then Joel's theology doesn't make any sense. His nomenclature about the sign happening before the day of the Lord. It doesn't make any sense unless they move their sign way to the very beginning, right? That's what they would have to do. Let's look at some quotes, and then I'll draw our study to a close. Let me look at my time. Yeah, I'm already at that time. Alan Kirshner asserts that the day of the Lord's wrath is distinct from the tribulation and begins after the cosmic disturbances and the rapture. That's Kirshner, according to Antichrist before the day of the Lord. So I'm simply quoting Prewrath authors to show that they are in harmony and in agreement across all their different resources regarding the sequencing that I'm trying to describe for you with these phrases, tribulation and wrath. Likewise, we have another proponent's views, right? We had Kirshner there. Proponent's views number 2, Charles Cooper, who picked up the ministry from Van Kampen after Van Kampen passed away. So Marv Rosenthal, his ministry was picked up by his son, David Rosenthal, but Van Kampen's ministry was picked up by Cooper, I believe. Charles Cooper argues that God's wrath is specifically his judgment upon the wicked, which believers are spared from, contrasting it with the tribulation that saints endure. This is Cooper according to God's elect in the Great Tribulation. Once again, we're seeing the Prewrath disambiguated version of these phrases, tribulation and wrath, to include tribulation being marked out as that which is poured out against Jews and Christians from the hand of Antichrist himself. So it's Satan's wrath. It's something that we do go through, but that's primarily aimed at us and not really aimed at unbelievers. It's an intense persecution against the object of his hatred, which is the elect. Likewise, wrath is something that, according to the normative understanding, face value hermeneutic that we pre-wrathers are holding to, wrath is something that sequentially follows after tribulation. They're not conflated. They're not overlapping. They don't run consecutively with one another per se. I say per se because tribulation is cut short by wrath, yes, but that's primarily a cutting short for Christians. For unbelieving Jews who remain on earth, tribulation continues for them, and wrath of God is being poured out. So for them, we do have some overlapping tribulation and wrath going on at the same time. Just because Satan loses the church during the rapture, he can't persecute us anymore because we're snatched out of the way, either live going up to be with Yeshua or resurrected. And of course, he can't persecute dead people anyway. That's just common sense. Duh. So it's really a persecution against the living. The rapture is that necessary rescue of the living, which rescues and takes away that object of persecution from the hands of the Antichrist. But unbelieving Israel doesn't get raptured. So they have to stay sheltered in place, hidden in the desert if you're in the Middle East. They get hidden during that time period, by and large. But Jews worldwide, they're still going to go through the greatest hell on earth that they've ever experienced. It's going to make the Antichrist look pale. And so we as Christians need to continue to realize that the support that we can offer them before that time comes is very necessary. We need to be witnessing to unsaved Jews. We need to be explaining to them that they could possibly experience a time frame that could probably rip them away from their very faith in God. Indeed, that's what Satan wants to do. That's what Antichrist intends to do by leveling that amount of persecution against them. He intends to destroy them as a people, but also rip them away from their faith in God, so that when the time comes for Messiah to show up near the end of the week, during what we might call the second coming, when he reaches out to Israel to invite her to take his hand in covenant partnership, if they've lost their faith in God, then they're not going to follow into a faith. They're not going to join with him in a relationship. They're not going to embrace their Messiah at the end of the week. They're going to be casualties. And that's what Satan wants. He wants casualties, right? He wants carnage. He doesn't care. So we need to be witnessing to Jews now, before that time period comes, right? We need to be explaining to them that there's only one way to save their very souls, but also there's a way to save their very lives, their very physical lives, and that's to trust in Messiah. So that's going to do it for our study tonight. Next week, we'll pick this up. We'll continue. I hope maybe that I can finish it next week. It was never my intention to make this long and drawn out, but we'll turn to scriptural support and integration for this disambiguation of these perspectives. We'll keep going with this understanding of how do we make better sense of the words that we're using. It's bad enough that the Bible's language is sparse in so many areas that it causes us to be a little bit confused unless we dig deeper. But it's worse that we add to that confusion by not explaining the terms to our fellow Bible students. We just rattle off words that we think mean one thing, they think someone else they mean something else. Neither one of us really kind of sits down and explains it to each other. So guess what I'm doing? I don't want to add to that confusion. I'm telling you guys what I think these words mean based on the way I understand them in the Bible. But that'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.